Millersfield, a quaint town, hides dark secrets beneath its peaceful facade. The Brentmore Hotel's room 303, sealed for a century, holds chilling secrets. Three friends, driven by curiosity, dare to uncover room 303's mysteries. Under a harvest moon, the trio's ill-fated adventure begins. Jay dares his friends to explore room 303, challenging generations of fear. The allure of fame and the unknown drives Daniel to join the dare. Daniel, despite his fears, leads the plan to explore room 303. The trio approaches the Brentmore Hotel, feeling the weight of their decision. They enter room 303, the air thick with decay and forgotten memories. Room 303, eerily preserved, feels like a tomb where time stands still. A sudden noise, a soft whisper that seemed to emanate from the far corner of the room, shattered the oppressive silence. Jay, his camera still rolling, swung his flashlight towards the source of the sound, his heart pounding in his chest. The beam of light illuminated nothing but dust motes dancing in the stale air. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the sudden roar of blood in his ears. Marcus, his face pale and drawn, nodded, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "Yeah, I heard it. It sounded like someone breathing." Daniel, trying to maintain a sense of calm, shook his head. "It's just the wind," he said, his voice lacking conviction. "This place is old, there are bound to be drafts." But even as he said the words, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss, that the room itself was watching them, listening to their every word. The air grew colder, and the silence that followed was heavier than before, punctuated by the sound of their own ragged breathing. Jay, his initial bravado shaken, lowered his camera, his gaze drawn to the rocking chair, which had begun to sway more violently, its motion too rhythmic to be caused by a draught. He swore he saw a flicker of movement in the shadows behind the chair, but when he swung his flashlight towards it, there was nothing there. As if in answer to their unspoken fears, the door to room 303 slammed shut with a resounding boom that echoed through the hotel like a death knell. The sound ripped through the fragile veil of their courage, leaving them exposed and vulnerable in the face of the unknown. Panic, raw and primal, surged through their veins as they whirled around to face the door, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "What was that?" Marcus stammered, his voice high-pitched and shaky. Jay, his face ashen, fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if an unseen hand had bolted it shut, trapping them within the confines of the room. "It's locked," he said, his voice strained. "We're locked in." The air crackled with a sudden surge of energy, and the temperature in the room plummeted, sending a wave of goosebumps across their skin. Daniel, his mind racing, tried to remain calm. "Don't panic," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "There's got to be another way out." But even as he spoke, a cold dread settled in the pit of his stomach. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they'd stumbled into something far more sinister than they could have ever imagined, and that room 303 had no intention of letting them leave. The air grew heavy with the weight of unseen eyes, and in the shadows that danced at the edge of their vision, they could almost make out the faint outline of a figure, watching them, waiting. Panic, thick and suffocating, filled the air in room 303. The slam of the door had transformed their youthful adventure into a desperate fight for escape. Jay, his usual bravado replaced by a raw terror, kicked at the door, his shouts echoing in the oppressive silence of the hotel. "Help! Somebody let us out!" His voice cracked under the strain, a desperate plea lost in the vast emptiness of the building. Daniel, his mind racing, scanned the room, searching for another way out. The windows were nailed shut, their frames rotten and unyielding. The only other exit was the one they had come through, now sealed as if by an unseen hand. He could feel the weight of unseen eyes on them, a palpable presence that seemed to feed off their fear. Marcus, his face ashen, slumped to the floor, his back against the wall, his eyes wide with terror. He mumbled incoherently, his words lost in the growing panic that threatened to consume them. Daniel, his own fear rising, knew they couldn't afford to give in to despair. They had to work together, had to find a way out before whatever had trapped them decided to reveal itself. "We need to break the door down," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor that ran through him. He grabbed the crowbar from Marcus, who was now rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. Jay, his initial panic subsiding into a grim determination, joined Daniel at the door, his shoulder braced against the heavy wood. The days that followed their escape from room 303 were a blur of sleepless nights and unsettling encounters. The darkness, once a familiar comfort, had transformed into a breeding ground for their fears. The shadows seemed to hold whispers, the silence punctuated by unexplained noises that sent shivers down their spines. The once unshakable bond of their friendship began to fray at the edges, strained by the shared trauma and the growing realization that something sinister had followed them home. Jay, normally the life of the party, became withdrawn and agitated. His dreams were plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying, that left him waking in a cold sweat, the echo of unseen laughter ringing in his ears. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something unseen lurked at the edge of his vision, its presence a constant weight on his chest. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, tried to rationalize their experiences. He researched old newspapers, scoured the internet for any mention of hauntings at the Brentmore Hotel, but found nothing to explain the events that had unfolded in room 303. But even as he tried to convince himself that they were just suffering from a shared case of post-traumatic stress, a part of him knew with a chilling certainty that something dark and insidious had latched onto them, its grip tightening with each passing day. Marcus, the most sensitive of the three, seemed to bear the brunt of the haunting. He complained of whispers following him, cold spots in his room, and the feeling of unseen hands brushing against his skin. His once bright eyes were now clouded with fear, his laughter replaced by a nervous tic that seemed to worsen whenever they were together. As the days turned into weeks, the once inseparable trio found themselves drifting apart, their friendship strained by the weight of their shared secret and the growing fear that seemed to poison their every interaction. Jay, consumed by his own paranoia, became increasingly distant, his phone calls going unanswered, his once welcoming home now shrouded in an oppressive silence. Daniel, torn between his concern for his friends and his own mounting fear, tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. He buried himself in his studies, threw himself into his part-time job, anything to distract himself from the unsettling events that plagued his waking hours. But the darkness had a way of seeping into even the brightest corners of his life, whispering his name in the dead of night, casting long distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and contort at the edge of his vision. Marcus, unable to cope with the relentless torment, withdrew into himself. He stopped attending classes, his grades plummeting, his once infectious laughter replaced by a haunted silence that spoke volumes to those who knew him best. His parents, concerned by his drastic change in demeanour, sought help from doctors and therapists, but no one seemed to understand or believe the source of his terror. The darkness had wrapped itself around him like a shroud, isolating him from the world he once knew, leaving him lost and alone in a sea of fear. Their once unbreakable bond, forged in childhood adventures and shared dreams, began to crumble under the strain of their shared trauma. The laughter and camaraderie that had once defined their friendship were replaced by an unspoken fear. A shared knowledge that something sinister had come between them, something that threatened to shatter their lives forever. Driven to the brink by the relentless haunting and the disintegration of his friendships, Jay became obsessed with uncovering the truth about room 303. He devoured historical accounts of the Brentmore Hotel, poring over old newspapers and microfiche, desperate for any scrap of information that could explain the events that had unraveled their lives. He sought out local historians, amateur ghost hunters, anyone who might have even a passing familiarity with the legends surrounding the abandoned hotel. His search led him to Father Michael, an elderly priest at a small parish on the outskirts of Millersfield. Father Michael, his eyes filled with a wisdom born of years spent battling spiritual darkness, listened patiently as Jay recounted his harrowing experience in room 303. When he was finished, the priest sat in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the flickering flame of a candle on his desk. "The room," Father Michael said finally, his voice a low murmur that seemed to hang in the air, "it has always been a place of sorrow, of darkness. What you experienced there, my son, was a glimpse into a pain that runs deeper than time itself." He spoke of a tragedy that had occurred within the walls of room 303, a story whispered in hushed tones by the town's elders, a story that had been passed down through generations as a cautionary tale. Father Michael's words ignited a spark of hope in Jay's chest. He finally had a lead, a path to understanding the darkness that had invaded his life. But as he delved deeper into the history of room 303, he began to realize that the truth was far more disturbing, far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. Father Michael, his gaze distant, as if peering into the annals of time, spoke of a young girl named Eliza Brentmore, the only daughter of the hotel's original owner. Eliza, he explained, had been a bright and cheerful child, her laughter echoing through the grand halls of the Brentmore Hotel, bringing joy to all who crossed her path. She was known for her infectious giggle, her love of hide and seek, and her uncanny ability to sense the emotions of those around her. But Eliza's idyllic childhood came to a tragic end in the summer of 1923. One sunny afternoon, as guests gathered in the hotel's opulent lobby for afternoon tea, Eliza vanished without a trace. Her disappearance sent shockwaves through the small town of Millersfield, casting a pall over the once vibrant community. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of Eliza. Search parties scoured the surrounding woods, their calls of her name swallowed by the indifferent wilderness. The police, baffled by the lack of leads, suspected foul play, but without a body, their investigations stalled. The mystery of Eliza Brentmore's disappearance became a dark stain on the town's history, a wound that refused to heal. As Father Michael spoke, Jay listened intently, his mind racing to connect the dots between the girl's disappearance and the unsettling events he and his friends had experienced in room 303. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was a connection, a thread of darkness that bound them together across the chasm of time. The Brentmore Hotel, once a symbol of prosperity and grandeur, fell into disrepair after Eliza's disappearance. Guests, their gaiety replaced by a sense of unease, abandoned the hotel in droves, their laughter replaced by an unsettling silence that seemed to amplify the echoes of the past. The hotel staff, their faces etched with worry and sorrow, whispered tales of strange noises and cold spots, their once pristine uniforms now stained with the dust of neglect. Then, one evening, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long, eerie shadows across the town of Millersfield, a group of workmen made a gruesome discovery. While renovating a section of the hotel's west wing, they stumbled upon a hidden compartment concealed behind a wall in room 303. Inside, they found what remained of Eliza Brentmore. The details of the discovery were too horrific to be printed in the local newspaper, but word spread like wildfire through the small town. Eliza's body, they whispered, had been carefully hidden, concealed behind the wall, as if whoever had taken her had wanted to keep her close, even in death. The porcelain doll, her constant companion, had been placed beside her, its painted eyes staring vacantly into the darkness. The discovery of Eliza's remains sent shockwaves through Millersfield, reawakening the pain and fear that had haunted the town for years. The Brentmore Hotel, now forever linked to the tragedy, was shuttered, its doors bolted shut, its windows boarded up as if to contain the darkness that had taken root within its walls. Father Michael, his voice barely a whisper, explained that some believed Eliza's spirit, unable to find peace, remained trapped within the confines of room 303, forever tethered to the site of her tragic end. Others whispered that the evil that had taken her life lingered there still, feeding off the fear and despair of those foolish enough to disturb its slumber. The room, Father Michael said, his gaze fixed on Jay, it amplifies whatever darkness resides within a person's heart. It preys on their fears, their guilt, their deepest insecurities, twisting them, shaping them, until they are no longer recognizable. He spoke of the room's ability to trap those who dare to enter, to hold them captive in a web of fear and despair. He warned Jay that he and his friends had stumbled into something ancient and powerful, something that would not rest until it had claimed their souls. Jay, his mind reeling from the priest's words, realized with a chilling certainty that they were in grave danger. Room 303 was not just a haunted room, it was a conduit, a gateway to a realm of darkness that he had unwittingly opened. And now something was reaching back, its icy fingers wrapped around their hearts, pulling them into the abyss. As Jay listened to Father Michael's chilling account, he thought of his friends, their faces etched with terror, their laughter replaced by a haunting silence. He knew he had to find a way to break the curse of room 303, to free himself and his friends from the grip of the darkness before it consumed them entirely. Armed with the chilling truth about room 303, Jay tried desperately to reach out to his friends. He called their phones but only reached their voicemails, their greetings now chilling reminders of the laughter and camaraderie that had been stolen from them. He drove to their homes but found them empty, the curtains drawn, an eerie silence hanging in the air. It was as if they had simply vanished, swallowed whole by the darkness that had seeped out of room 303 and into their lives. Daniel, he later learned, had fled Millersfield, leaving behind his belongings, his studies, his entire life, in a desperate attempt to outrun the shadows that haunted his every waking moment. He became a nomad, drifting from town to town, never staying in one place for too long, always looking over his shoulder, convinced that the darkness of room 303 was closing in on him. Marcus, unable to escape the relentless torment, suffered a complete mental breakdown. His parents, heartbroken and bewildered, committed him to a psychiatric hospital where he remained, lost in a world of his own, haunted by visions and whispers that no one else could see or hear. His once bright eyes were now vacant, his gaze distant, as if fixed on something beyond the realm of human comprehension. Jay, consumed by guilt and despair, realized that he was all that stood between his friends and the abyss that had swallowed them whole. He had been the one to suggest they explore the Brentmore Hotel, the one who had dared to open the door to room 303. Now he was determined to find a way to close it, to sever the connection that bound his friends to the darkness that festered within those cursed walls. But his efforts were in vain. The darkness had sunk its claws into him too deeply. Its tendrils wrapped around his heart, squeezing the life out of him. He became a recluse, shunning human contact. His days spent researching ancient rituals, desperate for any way to break the curse that had ruined his life and stolen his friends. He scoured old books, consulted with occultists and paranormal investigators, but no one had answers, only warnings. Then, one night, driven to the brink by despair and a growing sense of dread, Jay decided to document his story, hoping that by sharing his experience he might warn others away from the cursed path he had taken. He set up his video camera, its lens staring back at him like an accusing eye, and began to speak, his voice raspy and strained, his words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt, fear and regret. He spoke of room 303, of the darkness that lurked within its walls, of the girl who had been taken too soon, and the evil that had claimed her. He spoke of his friends, their laughter now a distant memory, their lives forever tainted by the events of that night. He spoke of his own descent into madness, the whispers that followed him, the shadows that danced at the edge of his vision. He finished his story with a warning, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes wide with a terror that chilled the very air around him. If you're listening to this, don't go near the Brentmore Hotel. Don't let curiosity lead you down the same path I took. And for the love of God, don't ever, ever look in the mirror after dark.